Let me start by saying this clearly, because tone matters. This video is not an attack on fans, and it's not about gatekeeping Dragon Ball. This is about correcting misinformation, especially when that misinformation is spread confidently, without context, and then walked back when challenged. Dragon Ball is one of those most influential manga series ever created. It deserves to be discussed with accuracy, not vibes, not rage bait, and not half quotes stripped of history. If you love Dragon Ball, correction shouldn't offend you, because Dragon Ball itself is about growth through challenges. I'm making this video because I've seen people claim that CCGoku is canon, that Golden Cooler is canon, that GT is canon, and the exhibitions, guidebooks, or staff quotes somehow override AkiraToriyama's actual continuity decisions. They don't. And by the end of this video, I'm going to show you why, calmly, step by step, with history, logic, and primary source reading. Before we talk about Dragon Ball, we need to stop and define a word that fans consistently argue over and consistently misuse. That word is canon. Because if we don't define canon correctly, then every Dragon Ball debate that follows is already broken. Most fans aren't actually arguing about characters, power levels, or timelines. They're arguing about a word they never stop to define. So let's reset that conversation. First, let's talk about what canon does not mean. Canon does not mean official products, licensed content, something published by Shueisha, something supervised, something approved, something animated by Toei, something sold in stores, something displayed in a museum or exhibition. All those things are real. All of those things are legitimate, but none of those things by themselves define canon. Those words describe legality and production, not story continuity. And this is where most Dragon Ball arguments collapse, because fans confuse official with canonical. They assume that if something is real, published, or approved, then that must mean automatically counts as part of the main story. That assumption is wrong. Canon does not mean this exists. Canon means authority. Canon means authoritative continuity. In fiction, canon refers to the body of work that represents the official story of a fictional universe as determined by the original creator or right holder's authority. The most important word in that definition is continuity, not approval, not popularity, not quality, not how much you like it, continuity. Canon is about whether a story belongs in the same narrative timeline without contradiction. Something can be official, licensed, written by staff, supervised, approved by a creator, and still not be canon to the main story. This is not controversial. This is how fiction works. Marvel fans understand this. Star Wars fans understand this. DC fans understand this. Even casual anime fans understand this. Marvel has multiple continuity, comics, universe, the MCU alternative timelines, and what-if stories. Star Wars openly separates its stories into canon and legends. Gundam has entirely separate timelines. The Fate series has routes, branches, and parallel outcomes. Multiple continuities are normal. Dragon Ball is not unique in having them. What makes Dragon Ball confusing is when it was created. Dragon Ball exists before modern multimedia storytelling standards. In the 1980s and 1990s, there was no unified canon policy. The manga came first, the anime filled gaps, movies were produced as stand-alone events, games expanded ideas freely. There was no expectation that every piece of Dragon Ball media had to fit in a single, perfectly consistent timeline. So over time, fans mentally merged everything together. They saw the anime, they watched the movies, they played the games, they read the guidebooks. And instead of seeing parallel continuities, they saw one giant pile of Dragon Ball. That's why these debates never end, because people are disagreeing about facts. They are disagreeing about whether continuity, they're disagreeing about which continuity they're even talking about. Here's the simple way to understand canon. Think of canon like a timeline. If a story can fit on that timeline without contradiction, it belongs to that continuity. If it can't, then it exists somewhere else. Still real, still official, still valid, just not part of the specific story. Approval does not override contradiction. Supervision does not override continuity. Popularity does not override narrative structure. And linking something does not magically insert into the timeline. Canon is not a ranking of importance. Canon is a map, and Dragon Ball does not have a map. And Dragon Ball doesn't have one map. It has several. So now that we understand what canon actually means and what it doesn't, the real question becomes, which Dragon Ball continuity are we talking about? Because until that's answered, no debate makes sense. And that's where things finally start to get interesting.
Yap for a whole minute, but didn't even address my argument. Are we dead ass right now? First of all, I was talking about the new Dragon Ball timeline that happens everything in order, which mentions Cooler and Garlic Jr. So when you're talking about DBZ is irrelevant. I'm bringing up new information and facts how the Dragon Ball franchise views Dragon Ball as a whole, canonicity.
To understand Dragon Ball canon, We also need to understand how Dragon Ball was actually created, because Dragon Ball was not designed as a franchise first. It was not designed as a cinematic universe. It was not designed as a multimedia narrative. It was not designed with spin-offs, timelines, or cross-media consistency in mind. Dragon Ball was a weekly manga. That single fact explains almost every confusion fans still argue about today. AkiraToriyama was a weekly mangaka working under strict deadlines. Dragon Ball chapters were written, drawn, and submitted week to week, often with little long-term planning. Toriyama himself has openly admitted that he improvised stories, directions, changed villains, mid-art, forgot characters, abandoned concepts, and rewrote ideas on the fly. This is not criticism, this is reality. Dragon Ball was created in an era where momentum mattered more than lore. If something worked, it continued. If something didn't, it disappeared. If an editor suggested change, the story changed. Dragon Ball's world was built as it went. There was no master franchise Bible, there was no long-term power scaling chart, there was no master timeline spreadsheet. There was only the next chapters. Now, let's talk about the anime. The Dragon Ball anime was not a second version of the same story. It was an adaptation, and adaptations are not the same thing as the material source. Toei Animation had a problem. The manga was being released weekly, and the anime was catching up fast. So Toei had to add filler arcs, extend fights, invent scenes, rearrange events, and sometimes change characterizations. Not because they wanted to rewrite Dragon Ball, but because they had to keep the anime running. This meant that the anime began developing its own internal logic. Anime-only scenes, anime-only power feats, anime-only character moments. Still official, still licensed, still real, but no longer identical to the manga's continuity. So now let's talk about the movies. Dragon Ball movies were never meant to fit cleanly in the manga's timeline. They were promotional side projects. They were designed to sell tickets, showcase new villains, create spectacles, entertain casual audiences. That's why villains appear before they logically could. Characters have abilities they shouldn't yet have. Transformations appear early. Power scaling makes no sense. This wasn't a failure of planning, it was intentional separation. The movies existed in their own self-contained continuities, loosely inspired by the manga and anime, not bound to them. Now the games. Dragon Ball games are commercial expansions. They exist to explore what-if scenarios, alternate outcomes, dream matchups, and fan service. They pull from manga material, anime-only materials, movie characters, non-canon forms, guidebooks concepts. They remix Dragon Ball freely because they are not telling the story. They're celebrating the brand, and that's the key difference. Brand expansion is not the same thing as narrative continuity. Now here's the most important part. Toei Animation did not operate under Toriyama's manga continuity. They operate alongside it. Toriyama wrote the manga, Toei produces the anime, movie staff created theatrical releases, game studios developed interactive stories. All officially licensed, all legitimate, all real, but not unified. That's why contradictions exist. That's why movies contradict the manga, power scaling breaks, characters appear too early or too late, villains return inconsistently, events overlap impossibly. These are not mistakes. They are the result of a parallel production. Dragon Ball was never one unified multimedia canon. It was a manga that became an anime, that became movies, that became games, that became a global franchise. And the fans never told clearly that these were separate narrative lanes. So instead of understanding Dragon Ball as a multiple continuities, fans tried to force everything into one timeline. And when it didn't fit the argument, and when it didn't fit someone's narrative, arguments started. People blame bad writing, retcons, inconsistencies, power creeps. But most of the time, the issues wasn't writing. It was a category error. They were judging one continuity by the rules of another. Dragon Ball only became confusing when you assumed it was built like a modern franchise. It wasn't. It was built like a weekly manga that exploded beyond its original scope. And once you accept that, Dragon Ball stops being messy. It becomes layered. So now that we understand what canon actually means and how Dragon Ball was actually made, we're finally ready to answer the question fans argue about the most. Not what's real, but which version of Dragon Ball are we talking about? That's where the real breakdown begins.
And second, you seem to not be educated in my argument, so here's the new Dragon Ball timeline, which I said mentions the history of Bardock, which mentions Cooler and Garlic Jr.'s story. This is not old information, this is new information, fresh and new to teach us about Dragon Ball, since it's been around for years, almost 3 decades right now, of Dragon Ball history. So again, refute this argument and not bringing up an argument which is just a complete red herring and a straw man.
To understand Dragon Ball's canon, you need the right mental model. Not a list, not a hierarchy, not a ranking of what matters more. You need a shape. So think of Dragon Ball like a tree. This metaphor matters because once you understand it, every canon argument stops being confusing. At the center of the tree is the trunk. The trunk is the primary narrative continuity, the core story that everything else grows from. In Dragon Ball, the trunk is the Dragon Ball mangas, the Dragon Ball Z mangas, the Dragon Ball Super mangas created by Akira Toriyama's story outline. This is the backbone of Dragon Ball's narrative. This is the continuity where events are meant to connect cleanly, chapters to chapter, arc to arc. This is the story of Akira Toriyama's authored directly, or in the case of Super, guided at the structural level. Everything else in Dragon Ball grows from the trunk. Now let's talk about the branches. The branches are not mistakes, branches are not inferior, branches are not fake Dragon Ball. Branches are alternate continuities. The branches include the anime adaptations of Dragon Ball Z, movies, Dragon Ball GT, Dragon Ball Heroes, Xenoverse games, promotional specials, and what-if scenarios. These branches grew outward from the trunk. They are inspired by it, they reference it, they borrow characters, events, and concepts from it, but they do not override it. And this is the most important concept in this entire discussion. Branches do not reconnect to the trunk. Once a branch splits, it continues into its own path. It does not loop back. It does not overwrite prior events. It does not retroactively change the trunk's history. This is where most Dragon Ball debates break, because fans try to treat branches like updates. They assume that if something appears later, it must replace what came before. That's not how continuity works. That's how versions work. Dragon Ball does not have one evolving continuity. It has parallel continuities. Let's use the anime as an example. The Dragon Ball Z anime is a branch. It adapts the manga, but also adds filler, extends fights, introduces anime-only scenes, changes pacing, and alters characters' emphasis. Over time, the anime develops its own internal continuity. It is consistent with itself, but it's not identical to the manga. Both are valid, both are official, both are real. They are just different branches. Now let's talk about the movies. The Z movies are not missing chapters. They are not secret canon arcs. They are standalone branches. That's why their timelines don't fit. That's why villains appear early. That's why characters have forms that they shouldn't have yet. They exist alongside the trunk, not inside it. Now let's talk about GT. GT is a full branch. It does not extend the manga. It does not continue Toriyama's story. It creates its own sequel continuity. GT is non-canon because it's good or bad. GT is non-canon to the manga because it's a separate branch. It tells a different version of the future, and that distinction matters. Now Heroes. Dragon Ball Heroes is a meta branch. It openly mixes continuities, it breaks rules, it celebrates contradictions. Heroes is not trying to be canon, it's trying to be fun. Xenoverse operates in the same way too. What-if scenarios, alternate timelines, and players' interventions. These are not attempts to replace the story. They are explorations of possibilities. Now here's the key mistakes fans make. They treat branches like retcons. They assume if it came later, it must be more accurate. If it's newer, it must override the old. If Toriyama touched it, it must replace everything. That logic doesn't apply here. Branches don't rewrite the trunks. They do not reconnect. All they do not collapse back into a single timeline. They grow outward. That means the manga remains the manga, the anime remains the anime, the GT remains the GT, the movies remain the movies, and the games remain the games. None of them cancel out each other. They coexist. This is not a downgrade. This is how Dragon Ball survived for decades. Dragon Ball isn't one story told badly. It's many stories told in parallel. And once you accept that, arguments about real Dragon Ball disappears. Because the question stops being what counts and becomes which continuity are we discussing? That question solves everything. So remember, the tree. The trunk is the core of the narrative. The branches are alternate continuities. They grow outward, they do not reconnect. And if you understand that, you understand Dragon Ball's canon.
What do you mean, can I show proof? Yeah,
Exactly.
because in Dragon Ball Super, right, it's canonological that there's a golden final form cooler, right? Because by your logic, if CCGoku is canon, then that means golden form final form cooler is canon.
Yeah, he's canon. What about
No,
him?
he's not. No, he's not, bro. Even final form cooler based off the movies hasn't been canonized yet, bro. You're spitting out false information right now.
Nah, he just showed up in Dragon Ball Heroes.
Now we need to talk about Super Dragon Ball Heroes, because this is where canon discourse completely derails. Super Dragon Ball Heroes is not a story-driven series. It was never designed to be one. Heroes is, first and foremost, an arcade card game. Everything else comes second. It was created to sell cards, encourage repeat plays, escalate speculates, and reward novelty. Not to maintain continuity, not to protect power scaling, not to extend Akira Toriyama's narrative structure. Heroes exist to answer one question. What if this fought that? That's it. That's the entire design philosophy. What if Goku fought this version of himself? What if the timelines collided? What if transformations stacked? What if rules didn't matter? Heroes is built on escalation, not restraint. And escalation requires freedom. That's why heroes operate in a different world, a different timeline, and a different continuity. Not implicitly, explicitly. Heroes openly advertise themselves this way. This is not hidden information. Now let's talk about power scaling. People often point out heroes as to say, look how strong this character is. But heroes' power scaling is not a measurement. It's a visual language. Strength in heroes exists to sell cards, create hype, differentiate variants. That's why power levels explode. That's why transformations stack endlessly. That's why characters break previously established rules. Heroes is not asking, does this make sense? It's asking, does this look cool? And that distinction matters. Now let's talk about CCGoku. CCGoku exists because Heroes needed a flexible avatar, not because he's part of the main Dragon Ball story. Heroes requires a version of Goku that could move freely between timelines, could interact with non-canon characters, could exist without affecting the main narrative. So CCGoku was created as a game-specific construct, a utility character, a narrative tool, not a canonical update. CCGoku is not an evolution of Super Goku. He is a parallel instance designed for a different purpose, and Heroes never claim otherwise. This is where the argument usually collapses. Some fans say Toriyama was aware of Heroes. Yes, awareness is not authorship. Some say Heroes is official. Yes, official does not mean canonical. Some say it's licensed. Yes, license does not overwrite continuity. To call Heroes canon would require something very specific. It would require an explicit statement that Heroes replace Super, Heroes override Toriyama's structure, Heroes is a new authoritative continuity. That never happened, ever. Not in interviews, not in guidebooks, not in promotional materials, not in an official statement. In fact, Heroes goes out of its way to say the opposite. It presents itself as a different world, a different timeline, a different continuity. If you declare Heroes canon, you create immediate contradictions. It would mean endless transformations are now standard, power scaling no longer has rules, narrative stakes disappear, continuity collapses, and DragonBallSuper becomes irrelevant. Heroes is not a sequel, Heroes is not an expansion, Hero is not an update. Heroes is a sandbox, and sandboxes are not timelines. This doesn't make Heroes bad, it makes Heroes honest, and it knows what it is. The problem isn't Heroes, the problem is forcing it to be something it never claimed to be. So let's be clear, Heroes is real, official, licensed, and play to fun. So let's be clear, Hero is fun, Heroes official, Heroes is licensed, Heroes is fun to play. But Heroes is not canon to the main Dragon Ball story, and it never needed to be. If anything, Heroes proved the point that we've been making this entire time. Dragon Ball is not one story, it's many, and Heroes is one of the branches on the tree. A loud one, a flashy one, a chaotic one, but still a branch. It grows outwards. It does not reconnect. So when someone asks, is CCGoku canon? The answer isn't emotional. The answer is structural. Canon to which continuity? Because in Dragon Ball, that's the question that always comes first.
Final form Cooler is canon.
Yeah, he's canon. What about
No,
him?
he's not. No, he's not, bro. Even Final Form Cooler based off the movies hasn't been canonized yet, bro. You're spitting out false information right now.
Nah, he just showed up in Dragon Ball Heroes.
Now we can finally talk about CCGoku, not emotionally and not defensively, structurally. Because CCGoku is not just a Goku with a different outfit, that framing is the source of almost every bad comparison. CCGoku and mainline Goku may share a name, a design base, and personality framework, but they do not share a continuity. And a continuity is everything. CCGoku has different experiences. He has lived through events that never happened in the manga. He had interacted with characters that did not exist in the main story. He has knowledge of timelines and mechanics that mainline Goku has never encountered. Experiences shaped a character. Two versions of the same character with different experiences are not interchangeable. Now let's talk about scaling. CCGoku operates under a completely different power logic. Mainline's Goku's strength is constrained by narrative stakes, training arcs, limits, and consequences. CCGoku's strength is constrained by nothing except escalation. Heroes does not ask, should this power exist? It asks, what would be hype? That alone disqualifies direct scaling comparisons. Now, narrative logic, mainline Goku exists in a story that requires conflict resolution, character growth, and cause and effect. CCGoku exists in a framework where fights are the point, outcomes are temporary, and contradictions are acceptable. These are not those same narrative rules, and rules define canon. Now let's talk about continuity comparisons. This is no different than Xenoverse Trunks. Xenoverse Trunks is not future Trunks plus more feats. He is a Trunks who exists to protect timelines, interact with multiple realities, fixes paradoxes. That Trunks cannot be scaled directly to manga Trunks. Same based characters, different continuities. Anime-only Trunks works the same way. He has scenes, feats, and moments that never occur in the manga. GT Goku works the same way. GT Goku is not End of Z Goku plus upgrades. He is a Goku who lived through a different future, different events, different transformations, different outcomes. Same character base, different continuities. That is not disrespectful, this is how fiction actually works. Treating CCGoku as mainline Goku would create contradictions immediately. It would mean mainline Goku has knowledge he never displayed. Mainline Goku has power without narrative cost. Mainline Goku exists in multiple timelines simultaneously. None of that is supported by this text. And here's the important clarification. Saying CCGoku is not canon to the main story does not mean it's fake. It does not mean he's invalid. It does not mean he's lesser. It does not mean fans are wrong for liking him. It means he belongs in a different continuity, and Dragon Ball has always had those. If anything, CCGoku proves how flexible Dragon Ball is as a concept. He exists because the franchise allows experimentation without damaging its core story. That's a strength, not a flaw. So someone asked, who's stronger, CCGoku or Goku? The correct response is which Goku, because until that's answered, the question has no meaning. CCGoku is strong in Heroes. Mainline Goku is strong in the mangas. Anime Goku is strong in the animes. GT Goku is strong in GT. Each obeys different rules, and none overrides the others. This entire debate only exists because people collapse multiple continuities into one. Once you separate them, the argument disappears. So let's say this clearly. CCGoku is not mainline Goku. Mainline Goku is not CCGoku, similar to how Super appears in the video game, but this is a different Super that is not connected to the manga or anime. They are alternate versions of the same character, same roots, different branches, and that's not disrespectful, that's correct. Now let's talk about Golden Cooler, because this is another example of how visual similarities get mistaken for narrative legitimacy. Golden Cooler does not originate in AkiraToriyama's manga. He does not appear in Dragon Ball. He does not appear in DragonBallZ. He does not appear in DragonBallSuper. Golden Cooler first appears in Super DragonBallHeroes, and that matters, because Golden Frieza does exist in canon. Golden Frieza is a form introduced in the main DragonBallSuper story. It has narrative buildups in universes, explanations, consequences, limits. Golden Cooler does not. Golden Cooler exists as a derivative design, and a derivative does not mean canon. Derivative means inspired by, modeled after, designed to mirror, create, or recognition. Golden Cooler was created because Golden Frieza was popular. Cooler is visually related. Gold equals escalation. That's marketing logic, not narrative logic. Heroes uses visual escalation as a core mechanic. New colors, new forms, new fusions, stack transformations, because escalation sells, and Heroes has no obligation to explain these forms within the main story. That freedom is the point. This is why Heroes produce things like Super Saiyan Blue, multiple forms, Ultra Instinct, combined with other transformations, fusions, of fusions, alternate versions of cosmic changes. These are not lore updates, they are variants, and variants do not override canon. Now let's address the common argument. Golden Frieza is canon, so Golden Cooler should be too? This is a faulty logic. Canon is not inherited through design similarities. If that were true, every Super Saiyan color would be canon. Every movie villain variant would be canon. Every video game exclusively fusions would be canon. That's not how storytelling works. Golden Frieza exists because Toriyama introduces him into the narrative. Golden Cooler exists because Heroes needed a visually intuitive power-up. One is narrative-driven, the other is derivative spectacle. This distinction matters. Heroes consistently creates derivative forms because it operates on a different incentive structure. The manga asks what serves the story. Heroes ask what excites the audience. These are not competing goals, they are different goals. And that's why Heroes can introduce transformations without consequences. No training arcs, no stamina limits, no narrative costs. That freedom is incompatible with the main continuity. If Golden Cooler were canon, it would raise immediate questions. Where was he? Why was he never mentioned? Why does he obey none of the established rules? Why does his existence have zero impact on Frieza's story? There are no answers, because Golden Cooler was never written to fit. And that is okay. Golden Cooler isn't broken. He's doing exactly what he was designed to do. He looks cool, he escalates power, he sells cards. That does not make him part of the main story. And this isn't unique to Cooler. Hero is full of derivative forms, alternate gods, color swaps, transformations, stack power-ups, what-if evolutions. These are not retcons, they are experiments. Experiments exist outside canon, so let's be precise with language. Golden Cooler is an official, licensed, real, valid within Heroes, but he is not canon to the main Dragon Ball continuity, and nothing has ever stated otherwise. Not Toriyama, not Shueisha, not Toei, not promotional material. Derivative forms exist to explore possibilities, not rewrite history. And once you understand that, Golden Cooler stops being controversial. He becomes what he always was, a branch on the tree, and a branch do not overwrite the trunk.
not be canon. Well, I'm sorry to say this, but the new Dragon Ball guides literally showed that Cooler is canonical to the Dragon Ball story, as also his father Bardock. Listen, I know you guys can't accept the facts, but the facts is the facts. This is the Dragon Ball history timeline, newly updated and fresh for the Dragon Ball continuity. And you literally see Cooler right there, part of the Dragon Ball timeline. Heck, he's literally right there. Is there any more arguments? That's the reason why Goku recognized Cooler. The producers and the staff already knew that Cooler was canon and part of the Dragon Ball Super story. Even GT is considered canonical, but just a different timeline, because it's a side story.
This is usually the point where people stop arguing with logic and start waving books around. Data books, guidebooks, encyclopedias, official character guides. And the argument goes something like, it's in a book, therefore it's canon. That assumption is wrong. Guidebooks are secondary sources. They are not the story. They describe the story. And that distinction matters. Guidebooks are written by editors, researchers, and staff writers, not the original author. They are approved, licensed, and supervised, but they are not authored canon unless explicitly stated to be. Approval is not authorship, and publication is not declaration. This is not unique to Dragon Ball. This is how editorial material works across all medias. Guidebooks exist to summarize information, clarify terminology, provide references, market the franchise. They do not exist secretly, rewrite the story. Now let's talk about phrases that causes the most confusion. Supervised by Toriyama. That phrase does not mean Toriyama wrote every entry. Toriyama validated every claim. Toriyama declared new canon. Toriyama personally approved every interpretation. It means something much simpler. It means he allowed publication, he corrected obvious errors, he approved the overall presentation. That's it. Supervision is not oversight, not authorship. If supervision meant authorship, then every anime scene would be canon. Every movie event would be canon. Every game storyline would be canon. They aren't, because supervision does not override continuity. Now let's talk about conflicts. When a guidebook contradicts the manga wins every time. Because the manga is the primary source. Guidebooks are downstream. They organize existing information. They do not create new narrative authority. This is why guidebooks often contain inconsistencies, contradictions each other, use outdated terminologies, reflect the era that they were published in. And that's not a flaw. It's a limitation of reference material. Guidebooks freeze knowledge at a point in time. The story continues. Now let's address a common argument. If Toriyama didn't disagree, then it must be canon. Silence is not endorsement. Creators do not micromanage every piece of licensed material. That's what editors are for. Toriyama has been open about forgetting details, not rereading his own work, allowing staff to manage logistics. This doesn't weaken Dragon Ball, it explains it. Now here is the critical rule. Guidebooks can clarify, contextualize, explain terminologies, but they cannot override the story, introduce new canon forms, retroactively rewrite events, unless the author explicitly declares it. And that declaration matters. Canon requires intent. If Toriyama wanted guidebooks to define canon, he would have said so. He never has. Instead, canon has always been defined by the manga and later structured story outlines for Super. Everything else supports that. It doesn't replace it. So when someone points out a guidebook or says, this proves it's canon, the correct response is canon to which continuity? Because guidebooks often pull from manga material, anime material, movie material, and game material. They blend the continuities for conversation. That does not collapse them into one. Guidebooks are maps. They are not territorial. They help you navigate Dragon Ball. They do not redefine it. And once you understand that, a lot of debates simply end. Because authority in fiction comes from authorship, not from packaging, not from supervision, not from approval stamps, from narrative intent. So yes, guidebooks are useful. Guidebooks are valuable. Guidebooks are worth reading, but they are not secret canon engines, and they never have been. This is where people try to pull out a literally gotcha. They bring up the Royal Book of Oz. The argument usually goes like this: see, an author didn't write it, but it's still canon. And they think that ends the conversation. It doesn't. In fact, the Royal Book of Oz proves the exact opposite point. Let's talk about what the Royal Book of Oz actually is. It was written by Ruth Homey Thompson, published after L. Frank Boma's death, and explicitly declares canon by the right-holding publisher. That last part is the entire argument. Explicitly declared canon. Not implied, not assumed, not argued by fans. Declared. After the writer passed away, the publisher made a conscious public decision. They said these books continue the official Oz story. That declaration is what made them canon. Not the fact that they existed, not the fact that they are sold, not the fact that fans like them. Intent matters, authority matters, and declaration matters. Now let's bring this back to Dragon Ball. Dragon Ball has never done this. Not for GT, not for Z, not for Super, not for the video games, and not for Heroes. This has never been an official statement. that says these overwrite the manga, these replace Toriyama's continuity, these are the new authoritative timeline. Never, not once. And that absence is not accidental, because Dragon Ball doesn't operate that way. At the time, Toriyama remained alive and involved. Now that he has passed, the manga continued later. Super followed structured story outlines. There was no vacuum to fill, so there was no need for a publisher to declare a successor canon. The Royal Book of Oz only works as an example because the original author was gone. The publisher stepped in and explicitly declared continuity transfer. That is the key difference. Now let's talk about why this argument backfires. When someone brings up Oz, they unknowingly omit something important. They are admitting that canon requires declaration, canon requires authority, and canon requires intent, because without declaration, Thompson's books would just be licensed sequels, which is exactly what Heroes, GT, and the movies are. Licensed, official, real, but not declared canon. This comparison destroys the official equal canon argument, because Oz proves that official material still needs authorization to become canon. Now let's be crystal clear. If Dragon Ball wanted Heroes to be canon, it could say so. If Dragon Ball GT wanted to be canon and replaced by Super, it could say so. If Dragon Ball wanted movies to override the mangas, it could say so. It has not. And the silence is not ambiguity here. It's continuity protection. Dragon Ball has had decades to make such declarations. It never has, because Dragon Ball has chosen parallels continuities instead. So when someone says, well, Oz did, that correct response is yes, because they explicitly declared it. Dragon Ball did not. No declarations, no canons. That's an opinion. That's precedent. And once you understand that, the argument collapsed, because examples from other medias don't weaken this position. They reinforce it.
Toriyama Sensei said, don't worry about contradictions. Contradictions happen between the anime and the movies, but they live in the same dimension, stated by Toriyama Sensei. Since the anime is not connected to the manga, meaning it's its own continuity, so everything in the anime and the movies is all canon to each other.
This is where the conversation usually shifts. Not to evidence, not to continuities, but to credentials. People start saying things like, well, this person worked on Dragon Ball, they were part of the staff, they were involved in production, and then they treat that involvement as final narrative authority. That's a mistake. Let's talk about Takayo Koyama. Takayo Koyama worked on Dragon Ball movies. He was a screenwriter. He was directly involved. And he has been refreshingly honest about that process. He has said plainly, almost everything was our creation. That statement is not an argument for canon. It is an argument against it, because what Koyama is describing is exactly what I've been outlining this entire time. Parallel productions, independent creations, separate continuities. This transparency, not authority. Working on something does not grant final narrative control. Participation is not authorship. Contribution is not canon declaration. If working on Dragon Ball grants canon authority, then the consequence would be absurd. It would mean every anime filler arc is canon, every movie villain is canon, every game storyline is canon, every promotional special rewrites the timeline. No one actually believes that, because we understand that staff's roles are scoped. Writers write within assignments. Directors direct within constraints. Studio productions within license. Final narrative authority remains with the creator or explicitly designed canon authority. And in Dragon Ball, that authority has always centered on the manga and later Toriyama's structured story outline. Now let's address another common tactic. People will quote staff interviews and say, see, they said it was real. Of course it's real. Real does not mean canon. Real means it exists. Canon means it governs continuity. Those are different categories. Staff quotes often describe creative freedom, production challenges, what they couldn't do. They do not declare canon, and they are not intended to. In fact, when staff are honest, they usually reinforce the opposite. They talk about intervening material, working around the manga, creating standalone stories, ignoring long-term consequences. They honestly align perfectly with how Dragon Ball was produced. Now here's the key rule. Authority in fiction is not crowdsourced. It is not interfered, it is not accumulated through involvement, it is assigned. If Takayo Koyama had canon authority, it would have been stated. If the movie staff had canon authority, it would have been formalized. If the anime writers could overwrite the manga wouldn't be the foundation. So when someone waves a staff quote and says, this proves it's canon, what they're actually proving is that Dragon Ball had multiple creative teams working in parallels with different goals under different constraints, which is actually the point. False authority argument collapses under their own logic, because if you accept them, you destroy continuity entirely. Dragon Ball would become an unfiltered pile of contradictions, and it isn't. It's structured, layered, parallel, separated by continuity. Staff quotes help us understand how Dragon Ball was made. They do not redefine what Dragon Ball canon is, and that distinction matters. So let's say this clearly. Takaya deserves credit. So do the anime writers, so do the movie staffs, so do the game developers. Their work is real, their work is valuable. Their work is part of Dragon Ball's legacy. But legacy is not canon authority, and it never has been. Once you understand that part, appeals to staff quotes stop being persuasive, because canon is not decided by proximity, it is decided by structure. Originally, I wanted to end this on a positive note, but it came to my attention that Dragon Ball Facts had avoided a debate during my recording. Except for talking about why this always happens. Usually they backpedal and try to hide in a corner or basically pretend like this discussion never happened, produce more content without actually holding themselves accountable. The reasoning for me making these videos was because I came across King Lion's live one day. He was discussing how every day it's the same thing with the anime community. Someone produces fallacies or misinformation and then it becomes an argument. Fans decide to take side without actually doing actual work. We are in 2026 and we're still debating if CCGoku is still canon. And how I personally feel about this is basically dancing on someone's grave. If you're going to produce content, at least be honorable when you do it. These are my terms. If you or anyone else want to debate me, it's a down payment, because I have already done the work and the videos are there for you guys to reply. The down payment is going to be no more than $100. If you want the teacher to teach, you're going to have to pay me to educate you. I am disappointed in Dragon Ball Fact's decision, choices, and his behavior in the Dragon Ball community. If you're watching this, all I ask is for you to grow, learn, and educate yourself. Be a better version of you. This concludes Debunking Dragon Ball Facts 1.